Hello folks, Simon here. Welcome back to the channel and another Final Fantasy VII Remake video. Just a warning before we go any further that I may end up at some point during the course of this episode speaking about the ending of the game to some degree. So if you haven't yet completed it or you're just trying to avoid spoilers, then you may wish to turn this video off and come back once it is safe for you to do so. Now, the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania is being released imminently, I believe it is, and this looks to be a fantastic volume, a treasure trove of Final Fantasy VII Remake information, including lots of development insights into the game. I've had a look at some of the samples and whatnot, and it does look beautiful, this thing. Unfortunately, you know, I don't read, speak, or understand Japanese at all, and it's only going to be available in that language, so it's pretty much going to be out of my reach. However, thanks to various internet translators, if I can call them that, there has been some very interesting information that has been coming out from the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania in terms of where the remake project is going to go in Part 2 and beyond. I would also want to just give a shout out to both John and Garrett Thompson for becoming the latest patrons to the channel, so thank you so much for your support there, guys. And of course, thank you to everybody who continues to support the channel, either on Patreon by becoming a YouTube member or through the Super Chat system on our live streams. Now, getting back to the Ultimania, I think there's going to be a lot of information coming out from this online over the next few weeks, so make sure we keep our eyes out as this stuff starts to get translated for us. But we're starting with a whopper, because according to Kitase himself, as is being translated, the project, the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, is not going to deviate from the original story. Now, there's going to be two ways of interpreting this, but I'm going to give you some quotes first of all, or some translations of the quotes. First of all, from Finished FF7R, who translates Kitase as saying, from now on, they don't have any intentions of making the next game completely different from the original, so please think of the remake still as Final Fantasy VII, and this is the original text that's being translated here. And Audrey, who does a lot more translation, I believe, over on Twitter, translates Kitase as saying, we're not drastically changing the story and making it into something completely different from the original. Even though it's a remake, listen to this, please assume the story of FF7 will continue as FF7 always has. And this isn't talking about part 1. Just to clarify, Audrey says here that Kitase mentions it's from here on out. So this is the subsequent installments, the subsequent parts of the project going forward. Yeah, this is really, really interesting. So Kitase is saying that the story of the original game is what is being adhered to here in the whole Final Fantasy VII Remake project. Now, for those of you that have played the game, Part 1, for those of you that have completed the game, have seen the ending, it's going to be difficult to understand how we're supposed to interpret these words because, again, spoiler alert, Final Fantasy VII Remake seems to finish, I'm talking about Part 1 of course, seems to finish in a way that sets up a completely different story for the subsequent parts than the original Final Fantasy VII itself followed. So what is it that Kitase is speaking of? Okay, so given what Kitase has said here, I can think of two, actually make it 3 interpretations as to his words and what they mean here. The first is that perhaps Kitase's understanding of what is changed to the original story is different to our own. For many of us as players and as fans of Final Fantasy VII, it's possible that the remake is going to go into a direction that we would consider to be radically different, completely different to the original game, but for whatever reason Kitase doesn't see it that way and he still sees it as the same story. Maybe that's one interpretation. The second thing that I can think of as to what might be going on here is that he's not saying that the story is going to be the same or even anywhere close to the same as the original Final Fantasy VII, but that it's a continuation of that story, sequel form if you like, and therefore it is the same story. Maybe that's what he means. It doesn't sound like that's what he means, but that could be a translation thing. What he might be saying is it's not going to be a new story, that it's a continuation of the original Final Fantasy VII story, which is what a lot of us are assuming it was going to be anyhow based on the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Therefore, what goes on in the game in Part 2 and subsequent parts could be completely different things, completely different events to the original Final Fantasy VII, and yet it is still the same story, it's just a continuation of it. So maybe that's what he means. The third option, I have to include it, I hope this isn't the case, but it could be, he's might just be saying that the ending to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 means nothing. that it's just there to throw us off base, and we're going to get into part 2 and realise that it is just a continuation of what happened when the party left Midgar in the original game. I think it's possible that perhaps all 3 of those options may be at work here to some degree. For example, and this is absolutely no criticism of Kitase, who I'm sure is really proud of the original Final Fantasy VII, and I'm sure he loves that game and he's very happy with what he and his team were able to accomplish with it. But he's approaching it, isn't he, as a developer, somebody that worked on the game, not in the same context that we are approaching it, as just pure fans of the game without any actual experiential insight to how it was made and all of that stuff. And that is probably going to give us different understandings as to what it means to radically change the story. Whereas to Kitase, you know, some of these changes may not be radical. To those of us who I guess others might call purists, I don't really like that word, but for some of us, you know, even slight deviations can be seen as big things. And if they're not thought through clearly, can have repercussions as to other plot points and stories that occurred in the original. And secondly, he could just be reassuring us as fans that the Final Fantasy VII Remake project is not trying to do its own canon, that it's not trying to split itself off from what's come before it, but it is a continuation of that same story. Now, ultimately, I understand there are many of you that were severely disappointed and felt let down by the ending to Remake Part 1. Okay, the fact that it seems to set up this radical, different story approach now for Parts 2 onwards that the original game did not do. What I would say is be cautious when you read Kitase's words here, because you could end up setting yourself up for even more disappointment. I'm saying this to myself as well. I cannot see how going into Part 2 after the ending of Part 1 there isn't going to have to be some radical changes to the original story. Regardless of what Kitase says here, I just cannot see how that would work. Perhaps the very basic story beats might be the same. So by that I mean, for example, the fact that the party have now left Midgar, they're going to want to pursue Sephiroth. Okay, that was the story of the original Final Fantasy VII. That is very likely going to be the case here. But how that's, and maybe that's what Kitase is speaking of, the story being the same, but how that story is now going to be presented has to be different. The context has changed so much. It's very likely that Cloud and the party may move on to Calm at the early chapters of Part 2, and Cloud is going to want to tell them, and they're going to want to hear about his experiences with Sephiroth, his experiences with Shinra, the fact that they were conducting secret experiments and holding Genova in secret containment in the Nibelheim reactor and all of that stuff, and how that sent Sephiroth mad. Okay, they're probably still going to want to know all that. But their experience now of encountering Sephiroth, which they did not do in the original game by this point, is going to mean that the presentation of these things is going to be very, very different. It's going to have to be. And also, this leads to the final point, really, which is we've had these epic battles at the end of Part 1 that harken back even to the ending of the original Final Fantasy VII. That one-on-one solo battle between Cloud and Sephiroth was almost beat for beat the same as the one-on-one solo battle between them at the end of the previous game, of the original game. You know, they've literally Square have pulled out all the stops here to go from that to then starting Part 2 with throwing Geishor Greens down to catch Chocobos. It's just going to feel weird. It really is. You know, how is that going to work? I honestly don't know. So my suspicion is, again, just being cautious, I could be wrong here, but my suspicion is that the very basic story beats are what Kitase is referring to with these comments, and they're going to be the same. Okay, the party's going to be pursuing Sephiroth, but how that's going to be presented is probably not going to be very similar to the original game. But before I ramble anymore, I think this is where you guys need to come in and save the day. So please do share in the comments, first of all, whether you liked the ending to Part 1 or hated it. That's fine. Just make sure you let us know so that we can see where you're coming from and where you would like to see Part 2 go, in what direction. Would you like to see it come back to something closer to the original game? Or do you think that would make it too disjointed from the end of Part 1, which has happened now, whether we like it or not? Or would you like to see Part 2 continue from Part 1 in a completely different approach to the original game, so perhaps a radically different direction? Just remember, guys, to please be respectful to one another. One of the things that I'm very grateful for is that so far, at least on my channel, despite the fact there are a lot of different opinions as to the remake, especially to its ending, people have generally respected one another, even when we disagree, in ways that haven't necessarily been consistent across other parts of the internet in the Final Fantasy community. So thank you so much for that encouragement, guys. Please keep it up. Be nice to each other. Let's have a fun conversation, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.